Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something today that I think a lot of you might be wondering about, and that is the difference between, you know, autistic shutdown and an anxiety attack. It's definitely a topic that can cause some confusion, and I'll admit I've had my own misunderstandings about it, but lucky for us, we have this great piece from Cheap ABA. It's a website that really tries to make information about autism more accessible, and they do a great job with this. So if in this deep dive, we're going to really be able to clarify things for all of us and hopefully even have some aha moments along the way. So the article starts by defining autistic shutdown. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. It describes shutdown as a coping mechanism, but not just any coping mechanism. They say it's like your brain's emergency brake. So when things get too overwhelming, it could be sensory overload, like from a really noisy environment, or emotional overload from a stressful situation. Your brain kind of hits the brakes to protect itself.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to remember. This is about protection. It's not about being difficult or trying to get attention or anything like that. It's a natural response to an overwhelming situation. It's a way for the autistic brain to regulate itself
Hmm.
and prevent burnout.
That makes a lot of sense. And the article mentions some outward signs of shutdown, like withdrawing from social interaction, going quiet, maybe even appearing unresponsive. It's almost like your brain's executive function takes a little break.
Right, and we hear that term executive function a lot,
Right.
but it can be kind of abstract. Think of it like your mental control panel, that part of your brain that helps you plan and focus and manage your emotions. During shutdown, that control panel can go offline for a bit, making it harder to do those things.
So it's not just about feeling overwhelmed emotionally. It's like the actual ability to process and respond gets disrupted. Now, here's something that really stuck out to me in the article. It talks about this feeling of emotional numbness during shutdown, almost like a disconnect from your own feelings. I hadn't really considered that before. If you ever encountered that?
Absolutely, and I think this really challenges a lot of the misconceptions about shutdown. We often associate overwhelm with outward expressions, like meltdowns or anger, but shutdown is this inward retreat. And that numbness you described is a very real part of it for a lot of people. It's like the brain is focusing all its energy on just keeping things from getting worse. And emotional processing sort of takes a back seat.
It's like your brain is saying, okay, systems overload. I need to shut down all non-essential functions to conserve energy. It's really a powerful way to think about it.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to recognize shutdown for what it is. It's not about forcing someone to snap out of it. It's about understanding that their brain is in protection mode and giving them the support they need to recover. Sometimes that might be quiet space, reduced stimulation, or simply acknowledging that they need time to process.
That makes perfect sense. Now, while shutdown is all about managing overload, let's talk about another intense experience that can sometimes get confused with it: anxiety attacks. The article describes them as these sudden surges of fear, peaking within minutes. And they list some pretty intense physical symptoms. It's like your body goes into full-on fight or flight mode.
Yeah, and that's one of the key distinctions between the two. Shutdown is primarily a response to sensory or emotional overload, whereas an anxiety attack is a fear response, often triggered by some kind of perceived threat or danger.
So even the triggers themselves can be really different.
Absolutely. For example, someone might experience shutdown in a crowded, noisy environment, while an anxiety attack could be triggered by a specific phobia, like public speaking.
And even though both experiences can be super intense, the way they manifest in the body can be pretty different.
That's right. And this is where it gets really interesting from a physiological perspective. During shutdown, the body may actually lower its physical responses. You might see a slower heart rate, almost like a conservation of energy. It's kind of the opposite of an anxiety attack's escalation, where heart rate, breathing, all of that tends to speed up.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Hmm.
So if we were trying to recap this for our listeners, what are the key things to remember when trying to figure out if someone's experiencing shutdown or an anxiety attack?
That's a great question. I'd say think of shutdown as hitting the pause button on your internal systems to protect from overload. It's often triggered by sensory or emotional stimuli, and it can show up as withdrawal, unresponsiveness, or even a sense of emotional numbness. An anxiety attack, on the other hand, is like hitting that fight or flight button in response to fear or danger. And it can be triggered by a wider range of factors and usually involves an escalation of physical symptoms.
Okay, so now that we know this, how might it change how we approach or support someone in either of these situations? It seems like understanding the root cause could make a big difference in how you respond right.
Yeah, absolutely. If you see someone shutting down, it's really about creating that safe space for them, reducing stimuli and just giving them time to recover, With an anxiety attack, it's more about acknowledging their fear, offering reassurance, and maybe helping them find some grounding techniques to regulate their breathing and help calm their nervous system.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach,
Yeah.
which makes sense. You got to tailor your response to what's actually happening.
Exactly. And that's why awareness is so important. We really need to educate ourselves about these different experiences so we can respond in a way that's truly helpful and supportive.
This is making me think about how often we might misinterpret these experiences, especially shutdown. What might look like someone just zoning out or even being rude could actually be a sign that they're really struggling to cope. With overload,
That's such an important point. It really highlights the need to move away from judgment and assumptions and toward understanding and empathy.
yeah, it's about recognizing that what we see on the outside might not be the full picture of what's happening internally. That applies not just to folks on the spectrum, but to anyone who might be experiencing overwhelm or intense emotions.
I totally agree. We all have different ways of coping, and it's so important to create a culture where it's safe to express those needs and to receive support without shame or judgment.
The piece we're looking at today has done a great job of breaking down those distinctions between shutdown and anxiety attacks. But before we wrap up, I wanted to ask about potential overlaps. Like, could someone experience both of these at the same time?
That's a fantastic question. And that's where things can get even more complex. While the article focuses on these distinct characteristics, in reality, these experiences can absolutely intertwine for someone on the spectrum.
So it's not always such a clear-cut either a situation.
Right. Imagine this. You're in a crowded, noisy shopping mall, and you're already feeling super overwhelmed by all the sensory input. Your brain might start going into shutdown mode as a way to protect itself, but then let's say you accidentally bump into someone, and they react angrily. That sudden jolt of social interaction, combined with the fear of conflict, could trigger an anxiety attack on top of the shutdown that you're already experiencing.
Wow, that sounds incredibly overwhelming, like a double whammy of intense experiences.
It really can be. And this just underscores why recognizing individual differences is so crucial. What one person experiences as a shutdown, another might experience as an anxiety attack, and yet another might experience as a blend of both. There's no one-size-fits-all here.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening for me. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now, and I hope our listeners do too.
Me too. And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that the more we learn about the diverse ways autistic individuals experience the world, the better equipped we are to create a more understanding and supportive environment. Sometimes the most supportive thing we can do is simply ask, "What do you need?" and truly listen to the answer.
That's beautifully said. A huge thank you to you for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into autistic shutdown and anxiety attacks. We'll be back soon with more fascinating topics to explore. But for now, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going. Before we did this deep dive, I had this oversimplified view of shutdown and anxiety attacks. Like they were these two completely separate things. But what you've said makes it clear that it's not always that black and white.
Yeah, it's true. It's really more of a spectrum than a clear division.
And that makes recognizing each person's individual experience even more important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, instead of jumping to conclusions, I think we need to approach these situations with curiosity and a willingness to learn from the person you know. Instead of saying, "You're having an anxiety attack," or "You seem to be shutting down," which can feel like labeling, we can ask open-ended questions like, "What's happening for you right now?"
Right.
Or "How can I best support you in this moment?"
I love those questions. They really give the person space to share their experience without feeling judged or misunderstood. It shifts the focus from our interpretation to their reality.
Exactly. And that can make a huge difference in how supported they feel.
This whole conversation has really given me a lot to think about, and I think it even goes beyond just autism. This idea of meeting people where they are and recognizing that what we see on the outside might not be what they're experiencing on the inside. That's such a valuable thing to remember for any interaction.
Absolutely. We can all benefit from a little more empathy and compassion. Creating a culture where people feel safe to express their needs without being judged, that's essential.
So well said. This deep dive has been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Of course, my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey of understanding. Remember, the more we learn about autism, the better we can understand and support autistic people. We'll be back soon with more fascinating deep dives. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations going.